Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Marketplace Risk Virtual Event Series. Today, we'll be taking a close look to the top 3 trends in seller fraud and how marketplaces can protect their businesses, reputation, and customers with actionable strategies to fight back. I'm thrilled to introduce you to our expert panelists. Virgilia Pruthi, Marketplace Risk Advisory Board member and Senior Director of Marketplace Trust at Expedia. Chris Hendrick, fraud industry expert and host of the Fraudology podcast, and Marianne Miller, VP of Cybercrime and Fraud at Proof. Together, they will help us break down what's happening in the space and how to respond effectively. A few quick reminders before we dive in. This session is being recorded, and the replay will be available at marketplacerisk.com. You are in listen-only mode. And please submit your questions through the control panel. We'll answer as many as we can. If we run out of time, feel free to email us at info@marketplacerisk.com. And with that, I'll hand it over to Marianne to get us started.
Thanks, Vex, for that kind introduction. And I just thought we'd start off by each of the panelists, we give a little bit more background about our background and why our backgrounds are relevant to our discussion today. And earlier in my career, I worked for eBay PayPal for a while, and it was a very exciting part of my career. It was early days of eBay and PayPal. But one thing that I really learned, I got a keen appreciation for the unique challenges in the marketplace. I was very familiar with the payment side of things, but the marketplace was really something new to me at that point in my career. And I found the risks that the marketplaces face were much more unique than what we see just generally in the risk area. So I'm really excited to be joined by Carice and Virgilia today, who have extensive backgrounds in marketplace, and I think we're going to have an exciting discussion. Carice, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Marianne. I am excited to be here today, too. My name is Carice Hendrick. I am the founder of Chargelytics Consulting. We work with merchants and marketplaces on chargeback analytics, as well as chargeback strategies, fraud prevention strategies, risk prevention. And I also host the Fraudology podcast. It's been around for about 5 or 6 years now, of hundreds of episodes with a lot of really great experts, and really just love to learn and deep dive and learn from the best in fraud. And it's really, for fraud practitioners to learn from each other. So I have worked with several marketplaces in my consultancy, especially in chargebacks as well as in risk prevention and risk optimization. So that's really where I'll be drawing some of my conversations from today. So Virgilia, I will let you introduce yourself a little bit too.
Thank you, Carice. And I want to check out your podcast now too. Excited. My name is Virgilia Pruthi. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm based in Austin, Texas, and I currently am at Expedia Group, where I lead the trust and safety product and policy teams. But I'm proud to have been on both sides of the marketplace. So I've also been a seller on the marketplace, having sold physical goods as well as virtual, and have also had a background in working with small businesses via Amazon Business, really thinking about how risk impacts reputation, whether it's through government agencies, whether it's through e-commerce sites or marketplaces that are global, very similar to Expedia. So super excited to chat with you all, really go into the different types of risks. And I'll kick it back over to the team, who are going to go to the first theme, I think.
Perfect. So what we really wanted to talk about today were, 3 types of seller fraud. We really hear a lot. I have a good friend of mine that works she's the head of trust and safety for a large marketplace. And when I asked her what types of topics or content she wanted to learn about, she said, you could do an episode or a webinar on seller fraud every single day of the year, and I would still need to know more. And so that was really what we based that today's topics on was that conversation I had with my friend, and knowing also that when I talk with marketplaces, I would say there's been a shift in the last couple of years. It was really focused on buyer fraud for a long time, and there still are buyer fraud, challenges. But those are, I wouldn't say easier, but more traditional to solve for than seller fraud. And when we're talking about seller fraud, we're not just talking about sellers on a physical goods marketplace. We're also talking about delivery drivers, gig economy, hosts for, home exchanges. Um, like I think I said drivers already. So, we're really trying to encompass all of those things. And I think the number one type of seller risk, if I were to put it into a category that I hear marketplaces struggle with a lot right now, is fake sellers. And that can be, someone who's committed identity theft or who has, taken on a persona that isn't theirs, to sell items that are real but are counterfeit. That could also be people who have taken on a persona to sell items that will never be delivered. That can also be, so those are some examples of what I mean when I'm talking about fake sellers. It can also be, so you can have a misleading item, or you can have a misleading seller, both, right? But really at the end of the day, it's not only going to impact your chargebacks, because most likely whether the person, receives the item or they receive a fake item, they're still going to be issuing a chargeback. But beyond that financial impact, there's such an impact to your reputation. No one wants to come back and make purchases from a, marketplace that has a reputation for selling fake items, or having drivers not show up when they say they're going to pick you up, or, showing up to a home listing and having it not be there, or not be a real listing. There's a family living there, so all of those things that greatly impacts a marketplace's reputation. And that's really, reputation is such a currency. I think that's why trust and safety teams are so important, because trust is a currency when it comes to marketplaces. And so having, people misrepresent themselves and misrepresent the items or the services that they're providing is going to impact your reputation as a whole. It also will, there's a lot of downstream impacts, whether it's a restaurant that, has had, a restaurant that's had a delivery driver pick it up but never actually deliver it. Now you've got all of those repercussions, so many different downstream impacts. I had and I'm blanking on his name and I feel so bad. It was back in February, I think. I had a guest on my podcast who had worked for Uber Eats and DoorDash on their seller, trust side. And he really deep dived into a lot of the issues that they had there. And that would be an episode that I would, definitely recommend. I'll try to pull up his name before the end of this webinar, so I can refer you to that and let you know the date, so you can find it easily on your favorite podcast app. But that was a really good example of a lot of deep dives into the type of issues that those types of companies have. But any of them, that's really what we're talking when we're talking about fake sellers. That's what we're talking about.
Grace,
oh yeah, go
I-
ahead, Marianne.
Yeah, I just have one top. I was thinking when you were, explaining these risks and, the bad actors that conduct this kind of, activity on the platforms. And the way I think that they really can scale this is actually sitting behind a fake identity. So if you continue, because if you're using your own identity, then of course you're going to get away with it once, maybe twice.
Right.
But if you're sitting behind someone else's identity, then you can scale this very, very nicely for nefarious reasons. So I think
you can use 20, 30, 100 identities, right?
Right. So really, I think when we're thinking about our fraud management practices and where we need to think about, where we need to have controls is definitely, identity proofing is really an important part of this whole marketplace ecosystem and gig economy ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I was going to add to that, like, and you said something, Chris, that I actually wrote down to requote you, which is trust is a currency. So when
Mm,
we're thinking about fake sellers and we're thinking about the identity portion, it is obviously we can think about revenue loss, right? We can think about the bad actor and the impact of the marketplace, but in reality, how you're able to measure based upon trust. And that
yes.
goes deep into if you ever need to support, well, why invest in this particular case, right? How much is
Mhm.
trust worth? It takes one time to break trust. It takes a multitude of efforts to rebuild it. And that is very key to a marketplace and the sustainability of that marketplace. So I just loved that quote. I wanted to amplify.
Mm. No, thank you. And I'll build on that, on something you just said. Uh, someone a long time ago once told me that trust is earned in drops, but lost in buckets. And that's, basically what you're saying as well, where it just takes one instance to lose it all, but it takes a multitude of instances to gain it. And if we think about the world we live in with social media and, media in general, especially the bigger your marketplace's name is, the more appetite there is for a news organization to want to cover that story, right? If there was a fake item, or if somebody was scammed, or something like that. So it just takes one instance for the world to hear about it. So
Right.
Marianne, you had a really interesting conversation with a mutual friend of ours in the fraud industry about, kind of back to identity and how that can impact seller fraud. And I thought I'd love to hear a little bit about that story. I think it's honestly one that I hadn't heard of as in depth as this until you shared it.
Yeah, and that goes into our trend 3 or trend 2, really looking at, fake identities. And, we started to talk about that a little bit. And Carice and I have a mutual friend, and he proceeded to tell me this story, which was very, very surprising and shocking. But he's going about his daily positions and his daily, job and risk and fraud risk, and he gets a call from the IRS. And and we all get these fake calls from the IRS, but this was really the IRS this time, saying, why didn't you report your income from, and I won't name the company, but it was a gig economy company, from this company. And he was quite shocked. He was like, well, I've never even used that company as a customer, much less work for them. And the IRS says, well, yes, they kind of pushed back, because they really thought he was just, telling a tale not to pay taxes. And so consequently, our mutual friend had to go to that company, explain to them that, you're reporting income from me. And it was very difficult for him to even reach the right person to talk to. And he finally did. He reached someone actually in the fraud department that helped him. And that was a long conversation. And I can't remember how many conversations he told me he had, both with the IRS and with this company, to get this straightened out. They found out, though, consequently, not only was his identity used once, but twice for 2 different delivery drivers. So it was enwrapped into an identity theft situation, but also a synthetic situation as well, where his social security number was the key to actually reporting the income. So it took a very long time. So here, what happens is, I call it what goes wrong when you don't get identity right. When we're really looking at the ecosystem of people delivering, goods and services to a consumer, a citizen, we're really looking at the fact that if they use, when you look in financial services, if someone uses one of our identities to open up, say, a fake credit card, of course, we report that to the credit bureau. We get the trade line taken off our bureau. We report that to the company and say, I didn't open up that credit card. And so that's a financial implication. But here in this case, it actually had ties to government and to, someone being, it felt accusatory to him. And it took a lot of time for to remedy this situation. So this is really, when we look at as fraud risk professionals, as the three of us are, when we look at risk in general, we look at how we consult and we manage risk, especially when it comes to identity. It can be very complex.
I feel like Marianne, that is it's such a difficult example, but a very real example of how so much of our roles is looking at those unhappy paths. And I know we were talking about that a bit too, which is everyone wants to get the job done. Everyone wants to have repeats, right? But what about the things that are the unmentioned, those unhappy paths? And who's the one who's accountable for like truly looking at it, whether it is for the finance industry, whether it's for the travel industry, health, etc. There can be points of harm at each of these instances, right? Or points of things that are friction or what don't go right. And so having insight and just making that a priority is such an important thing. And the use case you gave is so relatable.
Yeah, and I think I really like your point, Virginia, that if we take a look at those unhappy paths and learn from them and say, okay, does that unhappy path exist in my organization because I'm not addressing some gaps that I have in my end-to-end process? Is it exist because we're combating a very smart fraudster, a bad actor? So really learning and getting those lessons learned of say, how can I it's hard to eliminate them altogether, but how can I actually minimize those unhappy consumers or unhappy citizens from associating my business with an unhappy situation. I think that's a really important part of the whole discussion around what we think about these risks. So maybe we could move on to our third example that we were looking at when we were looking at our trends. We were really looking at gig economy in general. And Virginia, I think you had some thoughts about that.
I did. Thank you, Marianne. And maybe just like zooming out, gig sharing and gig economy has very different definitions based upon what role you are in, what industry you come from. So perhaps I can share like my definition of it. And before going into the trends, Marianne and Chris, I would love to understand your definition because oftentimes we come in with assumptions of like what things mean across the board. And so when I think about gig sharing or the gig economy in general, right? Marketplaces today, and whether it's the result of like what the last decade of how marketplaces have matured, they rely upon people who are whether starting their own businesses or trying to build their own lifestyles or revenue based upon their earned value, right? Or them being the service or them being the product. And so when I think about gig sharing or I think about the gig economy, I think is one person or one person being it could be a combination of users gaming a system and almost like force multiplying the ability for them to get additional share via workarounds. So that's my definition. And before perhaps diving into the trend, maybe Chris, I'll put you on the spot first. I'm curious, what's your definition of gig sharing, gig economy?
Well, it's hard to top yours. I think that, I think of it as a person or small business that is providing goods or a service on behalf of a larger entity. So, whether that's, someone who buys my groceries and delivers them, or, I interact with people in the gig economy almost every day. Whether it's, the person who shops for my groceries and delivers them, the host whose house I stayed at when I went on vacation, the driver who, took me to the airport, the person who was selling goods on a marketplace for my new home, all different types of, people who are earning money providing a good or a service on a platform.
I love it, Chris. How about you, Marianne?
Yeah, I think I want to extend it even out from the word gig economy. I want to call it the care economy.
Mm.
So we have, we live our lives online, and we all have different needs at different joints of our life, different points of our life. So the care economy is really, how can I find a babysitter online and in a trusted way? How can I find someone to take care of my elderly grandmother for a couple of days because I don't have the bandwidth, or she has a special need? I have, how can I have someone to take care of my pet because I need to go on a business trip? You
Mhm.
think about what I call the care economy, and that's growing. And the care economy can even fall under what I call, the dating. When you're meeting someone for the first time and you're trying to develop an ecosystem where you need to trust the other end of that conversation, when you're meeting someone that you might want to spend time with. So, I kind of separate the care economy from the gig economy, but both of them have everything in common around the risks.
I love that. And again, as
Mm.
y'all were talking, I was taking notes to requote you, but it almost like elevates and connects it back to why we ought to care about this. This kind of dynamic gig share economy, it's not going to go away. Pardon me, care economy, it's not going to go away, right? It's baked into the way that we live.
Mhm.
So, I think connecting it back to some of the trends or themes that I've been seeing, and again, coming from more of the travel perspective, right? I think oftentimes, when we think about risk, we think about it in financial terms. But if you kind of like maybe peel that back, there's so much reputation that is connected back to these types of gig sharing care economy that we rely that this particular entity we're going to work with is going to provide me with what I expect, right? It's not going
Mhm.
to be significantly different from my expectation. And as a user, that is like the core of why you would participate in a marketplace. So I'll give some examples. One trend is having a particular actor. I usually hate using that word, but I can't think of another way to describe it. So pardon if I'm offending anybody. But a particular actor acting on behalf of someone else. And this plays into age verification or identity verification, however you want to call it. So when we think about vacation rentals, right, whether it is through Verbo or Airbnb or any one that you may have leveraged in the past, right? The marketplace has particular policies and standards that deem that you must be a certain age in order to actually book that property. But who's
Mhm.
actually monitoring, auditing, ensuring that there's accountability for that? There are so many cases in which, whether they're parents or folks who are older, booking on behalf of their kids. And this is prime time with summer coming up, with end of the year, high school graduation parties, right? But when
Mhm.
things go wrong, right, going back to the unhappy path, who's going to protect the reputation of the marketplace when things do go wrong, right? Um, so again, thinking about age verification, applying that back to travel as it relates to these big events that we all love to watch and stream into, right? Whether it's the Super Bowl, whether it's the Olympics.
Mhm.
And again, how are we verifying that the users who are booking properties or activities when we have these big occasions are actually authentically who they say they are, right?
Mhm.
And something that's a very tricky conversation is what is the role of a marketplace as it relates back to legal, regulatory, and government. So again, when things go wrong, which hopefully they never do, but when things go wrong, right? If there's a stampede and there's a fatality, and a regulatory body asks who was at the event, do we supply them with the necessary information? Or if there is an attack, right, natural
Mhm.
or human made, do we supply the information of the travelers and or the suppliers who are in the area. So these are conversations that when we think about gig sharing or the care economy, what is the role of a marketplace? What is the role of us, and how are we managing our reputation while we're also protecting our customers at the end of the day? So I'm curious if y'all have been through this. I know, Marianne, you have had a ton of this is your speciality when it comes to identity in particular. So I'm super curious, like what you have to say. And then, Carice, having worked across so many different marketplaces, I'm sure you have more examples as well.
Yeah, when I think about Virginia, I really, like your example, I think about in the financial services arena, and again, I like to go back to identity, but to be able to identify who may have been the person that's contributed to a very negative event. Maybe, and in the financial services side, it would be money laundering, or financial transactions related to maybe human trafficking, or things that we don't want in our financial services system. Then that requires a financial institution to file something called a suspicious activity report, or as the risk community calls it, a SAR, SAR. But if you don't have the right identity associated with that account, and you're trying to report that bad activity to the right, compliance and governmental agencies, then you're actually looking at reporting another victim. So that can, we look at, the ecosystem again. If that identity is not correct to begin with, how do we find attribution? How do we know that that's really the person that, caused the stampede, or, had the human trafficking, actual transactions and money flowing that's affecting people's lives? So it really comes down to be in cases where it's incumbent upon organizations that they must or should require, say, cooperation with, say, law enforcement. First of all, you have to have the right information to be able to even do that. And that's, there's a kind of what I call some, kind of quotation marks around that, to make sure that we're doing the right thing as an industry, to make sure that that's, the foundation of our controls.
Yeah, and I think it's just going back to a little bit of what Virgilia said. There's such a real world impact within the gig economy, or the care economy, whatever we want to call it, especially if we're looking at, caring for, our pets, our loved ones, etc., whether that be, caring for them, or just driving them from point A to point B, or whatever it is, delivering food to them that, they might have an allergy. Like, there's so many issues. There could be so many potential bad issues. I think that you're right, Marianne, that if we don't get identity right at the beginning, then we're going to have issues all the way downstream, with all the way down to, if there were sharing of accounts, right, with delivery drivers, and maybe a friend of mine, for whatever reason, can't get an account as a delivery driver because of their immigration status, or because of, they already used their identity and had a bad record, had bad reviews on it, something like that. And I say, oh, sure, I'll open an account for you. Or, something like that. Those, having those, or, I'm the mother of an almost 21-year-old. If she came to me and said, Mom, I want to rent a house, but I'm not the age yet. Can you just put this in? Can you just put it under your identity? Then all of that, the marketplace doesn't have the accurate information about the person who's actually going to be in that house, or who's actually going to be there. And so there are real world consequences to all of these things that I think make it, the reputational risk, so much higher, because you're not just talking about ordering a t-shirt online from a retailer, and if it comes, it comes. If it doesn't, I'll just issue a chargeback. This is, the health and safety of your pet, or the health and safety of your child, or a loved one, or yourself. And so that's why, getting identity right, I think we do a pretty good job of enough identity checks, or maybe we just don't need that many identity checks on the buyer side of marketplace. But on the KYC side of, and I think that it goes way beyond just KYC. I think KYC is basic, and a check can sometimes be a check the box exercise for an entity, but it's not actually thinking through what do we actually need to do in those spaces. So maybe that should be the next step that we talk about, where we talk about, well, what can we do about these things? Because we talked about the problem, but what about the solution? So
Yeah,
Virgilia, I'll let you kick it off.
that was very well put together, Carice.
Oh,
I
thank
love
you.
seamlessly went into the solutions, and I feel you. I feel like we've presented so many themes and opportunities and trends, right? But it's like, okay,
Mhm.
well, what can we do about them? And so
Right.
perhaps I can just start, and then would love to maybe kick
Yeah.
it back to Carice. So I think the first thing, just working off of what you mentioned, is identity has to start early on. It cannot be an afterthought, right? But then how do we kind of play into, well, what about the onboarding experience? What about more friction for the users, right? And how do you kind of create that systematically? So I feel like a perhaps a measure or a mechanism that has helped, whether it was my time at Amazon Business or now at Expedia, has been thinking about what is that end-to-end framework from a trust perspective that is your non-negotiable. And I have a product background. So for me, really zooming out and understanding what is the end customer experience that you want to have. But the customer experience for a marketplace cannot just start at the buyer or the seller, right? It has to be across the board. What is the end-to-end experience that we want to have for our customers in order to make sure that we're unlocking the actual trust lever, right? So step one is thinking end to end. Step two is, what does trust look like for your particular marketplace, right? So it's, do you have the right signals that you're capturing? Where are we capturing those signals? That can come from KYC. And KYC, for folks who may not be aware with the acronym, is Know Your Customer, right? So KYC, that is one dimension. But now we're also in a world of AI and ML. How can you plug in first party and third party signals to really have a very core identification, right? So it's like the identifying the signals, leveraging first and third parties. Second goes into, what do we do with that information, right? For example, when I first started off, at diving into marketplace, I had a role at Audible, and we were building out a personalization system recommending books to different types of personas. And that sounds like it should be relatively simple, but the notion of a social graph and where and how you plug in and how you create clusters based upon all a variety of signals, and how you do it in a way that you protect both sides of your marketplace. So it's an identification of those signals and how you're grouping those signals into graphs that make sense, right? And the third is, what are the enforcement mechanisms that you have at your disposal, right? So enforcement mechanisms could be not just like the check, but also the removal. It could be the reminder, it could be education, right? So it's like those core actions that you want to instill. Now, I really went fast and like talked about first and third party signals, but that is the most crucial area, because going back to Carice, what you said in the beginning, if we don't start with identity, if we don't start with what are the things that we need to know about these users, then it's harder to capture that later on in the life cycle, right? And if we're unlocking what we want the ultimate experience to be end to end, then it's something that we have to have top of mind. So, Carice, I know for you, the biometrics, behavioral checks are something that you have really dived into in the past. So, whether it's that or even the device reputation, super curious in your thoughts.
Yeah. So, what I always say, and I've been saying this since, like, I don't know, I've been in fraud for over 20 years. And so I've been saying this for a long time, but, um, that all fraud solutions, risk solutions, trust and safety solutions should have layers. There should be a layered approach. Um, I think that, having an IDV solution at the beginning to, be able to loop in your KYC is important. I think other things that are important is layering on device ID and behavior biometrics. There is so much information that we can learn from a device these days, whether it's the browser language or it's the way that someone's holding their phone, or the way that they type in their password, that we can really identify who is using that device. And, is it the same person that logged in last time? So I could even, have your username and password, you could have given it to me, right? But because I type in the password in a different cadence, because I'm holding my phone completely different than you hold your phone, because my phone is a different, on a different operating system than yours, or has a different version of the operating system, then those type of things are all so helpful in being able to identify that that was the same that's the right person logging in.
Yep. No, that makes a ton of sense. Do you have any examples of like, and you don't have to name companies or people, but
Yeah.
you have examples as to how this works, like how this can actually, for those who want to get started, right? I feel like
Mm-hmm.
it's just starting off. So do you have any examples of those who've done it really well, or just like shedding more color on?
Yeah, and there's several companies that have done this really well. I think of a couple of delivery services that have done this, that have integrated in IDV, behavior biometrics, and device ID all within each other, and have those signals talk to each other, kind of like as you were talking about the cluster of signals, and having those, be able to inform each other. So they're not in silos where we have our ID verification system here and we have our behavior biometrics and our identity, reputation system here. They're all talking to each other. So did that, uh, was that one signal could be, was that driver's license authentic, right? Or authenticated? Was it a deep fake? Was it, altered by AI? Another signal could be, wait, they're holding their phone upside down. How do you type and enter information on your phone if you're holding it upside down? Well, you probably are using an emulator and using it at scale. Or is there remote desktop access loaded onto that software? So is someone else controlling someone
Yeah.
else's computer? Is someone being scammed, right? Where they're told that, they're the Geek Squad and they just need to log into their computer, but really they're, they're creating a whole new entity for themselves, or identity for themselves, or logging into a system, that type of thing. So that, that's one example. As well as, then you're using phone signals as well. And I think that we lost Marianne, and I'm really sad. I think maybe she's coming back. Good. Right on cue, Marianne. I was just gonna try to do your part justice, talking about the phone signals, because there's so many signals that can come from a phone, and Proof does that really well. I've kind of already talked about layering KYC and ID verification with behavior biometrics and and device intelligence. But then there's there's a whole bunch of new signals that are really remarkable from your phone that I certainly don't think a lot of people know about. So I'll let you go ahead and dive into that.
Yeah, and apologies to everyone. I just had a disconnection, but it came right back. What I think about, and I think it's really important that if you think about, if you leave your house and you forget your phone, you go back and get it. We
Mhm.
don't just say, oh, okay, it's fine. I can go off on my merry way and not have my phone with me. Or if I, leave it at the restaurant and all of a sudden you can't find it and you run back to the restaurant to find your phone. Our phones are with us all the time. And really they almost become a proxy for our identity, because we really use them. We use them to communicate for personal reasons, for maybe work reasons, for, to keep in contact with family and friends. So our phones are with us a lot. And at Prove, we use the phone and signals from the phone and analytics from our solutions to be able to start to answer the question, is Mary Ann Miller at the other end of an event? And when I say an event, could be an onboarding event, it could be a high-risk event around moving, changing an address or changing a phone number, or things that you might want to do on a platform to make it easy for your customer. So if you think about it, we check again, the possession of the phone, using the SIM on the phone. We check the reputation of the phone. Is this a risky line type? Has there been a long tenure associated with the phone? Has that person owned the phone for a long time? We look at, has the phone been SIM swapped? That's a very shocking event if it can happen to you. Or has it been ported, but not ported by the customer, ported by someone that got a hold of your number and called the telco and took over your phone? So we look at all of these risky events. And then lastly, you look at the identity associated with that phone. So if you add up all of those signals and you add up all of those layers of analytics and reason codes and important things that can come from a phone, that really starts to really add up to the equation of identity. And again, those are important things to have, whether you're a marketplace or a financial services or a healthcare company. It really doesn't matter. It's really important that you start to add what I call more modern checks to your identity stack or your KYC stack.
There's so much that you just shared in that, Mary Ann, that it's so real. And it's interesting, to your point, that we are walking around with these things day in and day out, right? And the value that is stored with us. I'm super curious on y'all's thoughts on ethical AI or ethical data is something that I'm very, very passionate about. And especially being in the space that we are, there's always a question, again, going back to what is appropriate to protect versus what is too much. Um, so when it comes time to the solutions, how do y'all view that notion of the ethics, right? And how you balance the value add versus the former?
Yeah, I think it's really important, Virginia, and I think you brought up a good point. I think it's good to think about what data you can use in a privacy preserving way. And that when you think about when you build product or when you actually look at the analytics, especially if you're a solution provider like Prove, we always look at things through a privacy preserving way. And in fact, at Prove, we hold no PII of the customer, and our ability to produce results that are very important for our customers around confidence of identity. So I think that it's tricky when you look at things like age verification, because certainly you need to know things like, you really need to be able to have the date of birth, but to be able to connect that to who's presenting the information, who's presenting that date of birth, because there's so many identity and compliance routines now that rely on the fact is that person's age a certain age because of maybe the content or the process that they're, if it's gaming or if it's another kind of I would say service that they're participating in that requires age verification. But I think privacy preserving is a very important word in the question that you asked.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point. I think there's a lot of information now, the signals that I talked about from behavior biometrics and device ID, the signals that Mary Ann talked about, the signals that you talked about as well, Virgilia, that have nothing to do with PII. And so you can be able to really know a lot about a person or a device without ever knowing, the information that could compromise their identity later on in a data breach. Whether that's, name, address, date of birth, etc. Now you do have to collect that information, especially for KYC, but doing it in a way that, ensuring that your vendors are, not only PCI compliant, but they're doing all the all the things that are, responsible and ethical in managing your data and your customers' data, I think is really important. Over time, working with so many different merchants and marketplaces, I've definitely kind of created in my head, at least, a pretty good list of the best in class solutions within each department or each category, based on the merchants that use them and based on the feedback of the merchants that use them, because oftentimes I'm the one that's called when a merchant wants to vent about their solution or wants to say, wow, we're doing something really cool. I want to tell you about it. Like, we're doing something cooler than anyone else, and so oftentimes I get to hear those things. So I kind of have a list in my head of the best of the best in each of those categories. And I think that helps with that too, because that if XYZ marketplace is working with them, they've gone through a lot of scrutiny. And, if they're happy with them and they're working with them, that's even better. And so I think there's, just like we talked about reputation in marketplaces, there's a lot of reputation in solution providers in the space. And so really leaning on peers or, someone like me who talks to your peers, who can say, actually, like, this is the right company to go with, or, this company really will protect your customers' data well, I think can be a really good option.
Yeah,
Um,
I like that. No, go ahead, Virgilia. Yeah.
I was going to make one comment, which is the notion of feedback loops as a solution.
Yes.
Feedback loops when it comes to privacy preserving. And there's not just there's like the expert feedback loops that you're talking about, Carice, and there's
Mhm.
like literally applying feedback loops back into your signals,
In the product, yes.
right? And the most powerful solutions are the ones that are able to Marianne's point, preserve the privacy. And then going back to your point, Carice, like have those feedback loops just instilled in. So sorry for interrupting, Marianne. Go
No,
ahead.
I was almost I like audibly laughed when you said feedback loop, because I had a guest on my podcast just 2 weeks ago, Matt Vega, who I've been friends with for a long time. He used to work for Instacart. He's worked for a lot of different crypto companies. And he went on quite the tangent about feedback loops just the other day on my podcast, and the importance of them from service providers, and the integrity along with the feedback loop, and how you need to have, integrity in that feedback loop so that you're constantly being able to reiterate and re just be able to improve upon the solution continually. So that's why I audibly laughed, because I was like, oh, feedback loop. That was like the drinking word of my podcast 2 weeks ago.
I also think, speaking of feedback loops, one really good way, and webinars like we're having today is to, good way to learn information. At Proof, we hold industry roundtables. So we get people around the table to talk about, some of the challenges that we talked about today, but also like, how do you solve those challenges? How do we address those? And I think that's really important as an industry. And I think our, the marketplace industry is good. I mean, this is a great, way that, this is being sponsored today, and how we're, actually working as an industry. So I think close collaboration in the industry can really benefit our platforms, but also the solutions, and it can protect so much in the ecosystem, by just sharing best practices, sharing good technology, sharing new policies that might need to go into place, or new approaches.
Totally.
That's great. Well, I think that this has been such a good discussion, and I wanted to know if, you guys had any questions for me or for each other, as we look to wrap up
Yeah,
this
Carice, I
webinar.
do have a question for you. Yeah.
Okay, I asked for it.
Yeah, that's right. You're so active, within the community of e-commerce and marketplaces. You're very well known, and you hold your, podcasts on a regular basis. I happen to be a fan of that podcast and listen in. And I recommend the audience here, if anyone is not familiar with the podcast, certainly check it out. But what are the hot topics in the marketplace that you've come across recently with your audience? And what are some of the things that's being talked about now? And what are some of the risks and challenges that you hear?
Good question. So before I answer that question, from the beginning of this webinar, I completely spaced out on a guest's name, who used to work for Uber Eats and DoorDash, and that was Patrick Hall. I'm so sorry, Patrick. And it was back in February. So it was February 18th of this year. So if you go on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and you go to Fraudology, and you just search back to February 18th, you'll find that episode. Really good use case examples of seller fraud and other issues in the gig economy. But to answer your question, Marianne, maybe one of the most topical things that's come up. So I host informal roundtables just via Zoom with dozens of online merchants on a regular basis. And we had a kind of an impromptu conversation a couple weeks ago about how the tariffs in the US were impacting user behavior in marketplaces. How they were, causing a shift in behavior. Everything in trust and safety is cause and effect. And there was really, an issue with especially international sellers that are selling to the US, who are starting to reach out to people in the US, asking them to sell on their behalf or to, ship via another country. There was a marketplace seeing account takeovers in Canada, presumably because they were, wanting to ship a product to Canada and then would reroute it to the US from Canada to the US. So there'd be less tariffs. Just a lot of things like that. There were also Chinese sellers for marketplaces that were trying to set up US entities and straw sellers, so to speak, in the US, looking for that online and kind of some suspicious places that often looked like human trafficking or, mule accounts. So definitely that's one hot topic recently in the marketplaces that I thought was a fascinating conversation with about 24, 25 merchants, and several marketplaces were within the retailer group talking about how they had seen such a shift in behavior just since the tariffs in the US were announced.
Well, Carissa, almost makes a new category of fraud. It's almost like we have a new fraud type.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah,
okay.
Frank McKenna and I did an article together. I called Frank right away. So Frank is the author of the Frank on Fraud blog, and he's a very good friend of Marianne and I's. And I just happened to have a call with him the day after I had that impromptu call or, topic come up in one of my open Zoom calls. And he said, that sounds like an article. And so I just kind of gave him like the 5 different ways that we were seeing. And so he did an article about that about a month ago or so, that really went in depth on the different tariff dodging, ways of doing things. They were also seeing, companies trying to figure out how to, go around that too. And so there were some really interesting examples that he was able to find in his article. But yeah, I just saw that someone asked another question. Is there any recommendations for fraud detection tools that marketplaces should consider to protect against identity theft? I think, the problem we have is we don't want to say any specific names, right? Like, but we did talk about different categories of tools, behavior biometrics, device intelligence, KYC, device verification. Marianne talked a lot about identity proofing and phone signals, and Prove is a very good, example of a company that provides those. Yeah.
I think that's a really good list, Carice. And I always think that making sure that you do end-to-end risk assessments and then look at gaps, and look at where, you really need to focus on your, your strategy as a whole. I'll give an example, talking about your podcast and information shared. A recent roundtable, it was brought to my attention that Visa just released a report, and it talked about application fraud. And application fraud ties into this identity theme that we've been talking about. And I posted the report and just an aspect of the report on LinkedIn, and I had 14,000 views on it, and then like 31 reposts and lots of reactions. And what it really stated was that it was a global report, but in North America alone, application fraud was at 600 basis points, or 6% of loss. That's huge. That's very
Mm-hmm.
a big uptick. Considering, only a few years ago, it was much lower than that. So we are looking at, when we think about tools, we are looking at stress on the identity aspects of our businesses. Whether it's applying for a credit card or applying to be on a platform to do, like for the care economy, for the gig economy, for selling goods. There is stress on that part of the ecosystem, and that's where I really recommend the audience focus on, to say, how can I improve my identity controls, at the same time keeping my customer experience, to a place where my customers feel welcomed. I put the welcome mat out, during that acclimation and that flow as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
I would also say, just really fast, sorry, Virgilia, I just wanted to say that, if the person who asked that question wants to reach out to me directly, I can certainly share, a couple of things as well, offline. But Virgilia, I'd love to know as well what you recommend for finding
You're
those.
so it's all good. I wanted to just make sure that folks understood that this is a global thing, right? This is
Yes.
so Marianne, with like your stats and increase like the high level kind of perspective, we have to zoom out and think globally. This is
Mm-hmm.
not a single geo, single locale type of a theme, trend, or
Such a
solution.
good point.
So whenever you think through these things, identity, fraud risk, trust safety, these are global issues and they should be treated as such. Global and localization are things that should be top of mind when you're thinking solution providers as well, and really making sure that it's not just about, yeah, I can translate this thing, or yes, I can deal with multi-language. No, it's
Right.
and the differences in currency. Do you understand
Yes.
the implications of a geography being mobile first versus computer first, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think that's the dynamic I wanted to just like elevate is our industry is not just a single geo, it is global in nature. So
I'm
I
so
think
glad you said that. So glad, because there might be, a solution that works great for one geography that won't work for the other, because of cultural differences as well. Or just the people, the customer's behavior or customer's, opinion of something. And so, zooming out and seeing it globally, but then also zooming in for localization and having experts that understand different geos is really important.
And Virginia, I think that's an incredible point. And I think we're coming to the end, but that
Yeah.
could be our next webinar, because I think just focusing on how do you manage your business with through a global lens. And
Mm-hmm.
absolutely, your point is well taken. And I think a good takeaway for the audience to think about that, because that's really important around our controls, around how our policies, around how we service the customer. It's such a global lens, and the risks are global. Yes. Well,
Thank
it's
you. Oh,
so much fun. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Max.
no, go
no,
ahead.
I think we're at time, and I really enjoyed this conversation today. Thanks.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you, Marianne, Virgilia, and Chris, and thank you to our audience for joining on today's Marketplace Risk virtual event. The session is recorded and will be available at marketplacerisk.com. And please do not forget to check our website for past sessions, podcasts, and info on our upcoming events in New York, Sao Paulo, and London. Whether you want to sponsor, speak, or attend, we'd love to have you involved. If we didn't respond to your question, please email us to info@marketplacerisk.com, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.